Hello, and welcome to the Simply Human YouTube channel and podcast. I'm Christina, Caro, clinical psychologist, and my partner, executive leadership coach Karen Lee Lynskey, is feeling under the weather today, so I am flying solo. Today, I wanted to do a quick follow-up to our last episode on getting your needs met. One of the key takeaways is the recognition that when we are needing the cooperation of another person to get our needs met, for example, say it's meaningful time or affection from your partner, or maybe you need resources from your team leader, you have to recognize that mind reading is not a thing, and that in order to improve the odds of having your needs met, you have to get better at making skillful requests. So this episode is going to cover one skill in effective request making that I call using the language of willingness. But before we start, do us a favor and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification button so you know when a new episode is posted. And if you're on the podcast, you can hit a text us link that's in the show notes, and that'll send us your comments and questions directly to our email at simplyhuman.connect@gmail.com. And if you're on any platform, if you can leave a comment of 7 words or more, it actually helps the algorithm recognize it as meaningful engagement. And it tells the algorithm that, oh, this is a good podcast or this is a good episode, and I should put it in front of more people. So you can help us get the show out to more people. This is a free resource. And for me, it was to address the shortage of mental health care providers. And in my community, a lot of people stuck on a wait list. So this resource is available for people to start doing some of their own inner journey and their own work for some foundational skills while they're waiting to get in to see a professional. Now let's get into it. We covered in our episode on getting needs met that the cost of unmet needs can result in stress, resentment, depression, anxiety, and even damaged relationships. We also talked about how the patterns and habits and the expectations that we've developed around needs being met are often established in childhood and in some cases even infancy. And examples of childhood influences can include some evidence that even being a colicky baby can impact your sense of your ability to have your needs met, especially if there were other stressors in the home. Growing up in a home where needs were not met due to any number of stressors, including neglect, substance abuse, trauma, or family dysfunction. Yeah, I come from Gen X, and there's like a lot of sweatshirts out there with the motto, Generation X, raised on neglect and hose water. There is a generational aspect, including the boomer generation, World War II generation, where there were messaging around that there was scarcity. And so needs were minimized, or needs were something that you shouldn't express because it was hard on everybody to get it met. So there's a bit of a taboo. If there were cultural norms like stoicism, where enduring without was actually highly valued, or even economic stress, such as poverty or scarcity, or even if, say, parents, they're well-meaning, but they're exhausted from trying to just provide for their family and they just didn't have a lot of bandwidth left, you might have gotten subtle unconscious messaging that there's no room for your needs. Sometimes it's direct messaging where when you try to express a need, were met with criticism that you were selfish or you were spoiled. So you can see there's many, many things. I mean, this is just some of the common reasons why people might have issues or challenges with acknowledging they have a need, communicating they have a need, and knowing how to get needs met. I mean, for me, this was a big part of my personal journey. When I first started therapy, I remember my therapist making a comment about how it must have been difficult getting my needs met. I was born into a family with World War II and Depression era generation parents. And when she asked me that, I didn't even know what she was talking about. I was, what do you mean, like food and clothes? And she had said, no, your emotional needs. And I literally said, what is that? So she's like, oh, we've got some work to do. So many of us, this is a really common challenge. So I just want people to know you're not alone if you have this struggle. And I encourage you to go back and listen to the episode that we just did, which is called Hidden Reasons Why Your Needs Aren't Being Met and How to Fix It, because we go over sort of a basic framework on how to start developing the skills on getting your needs met. In this episode, we want to focus on just one aspect on how to get your needs met. So, we talked about in the last episode that there are three important components. You have to be aware, first of all, that you have a need, and then you have to be able to assess and evaluate that it is a valid need. And it was about self validation, which is different from waiting for someone else to tell you that your need is valid. And then the next step is that when this is about a need that you can't meet yourself and it's dependent on someone else's cooperation, that you have to be skillful in communicating the need and making a request. And today's skill is called the language of willingness. Now, I'm making a distinction between asking if someone, quote, can do something for you and if someone is willing to do something. This is why I call it the language of willingness. Now, this may seem like a subtle distinction, okay? Asking if someone can do something focuses on their ability or their capacity or the certain circumstances that enables them to complete the task. For example, can you pick up the groceries? Technically, you're just asking about whether someone has like the transportation, the time, the physical ability to actually get groceries. So, can they? Asking if someone is willing to do something focuses on their choice, their consent, and their desire to help. Are you willing to pick up the groceries? This acknowledges their agency, meaning that they have a power to choose or not choose, and directly addresses whether they want to or whether they feel comfortable doing the task. This distinction becomes important because someone might be capable so they can do something, but they're not comfortable or interested. They're not actually willing to do it. To responding to can you with yes doesn't necessarily mean agreement to do it. Like if you have a teenager and like, hey, can you take out the trash? Fine. So saying yeah, they're not really wanting to do it. They're just like, I have to do it. And that's not, when we're talking about needs, that isn't really what we're looking for. That's actually just compliance. That's not a willingness to engage and actually address your need. And anyone who is listening, you can hear the difference between fine, I'll do it, and a real genuine yes, of course, I would want to do that for you. So willingness shows more respect for the other person's autonomy and feelings when we're asking about their willingness. So in practice, many people use can you as an indirect way to ask will you. But by being precise in your language and actually using the language of willingness, you can actually have clearer communication and a better respect for boundaries, because then the person is more likely to give you a more accurate response to the question, because it is very different to say, well, are you willing to do this? When a person says yes or no, they're generally being a lot clearer about their boundaries. So it shifts the focus from just the ability to do something. Yes, I can take out the trash. Of course, I can take out the trash. To actually choice and consent. Yeah, I'm willing to do that for you. And while it's simple to switch from can to willing to, this skill, it's not necessarily easy, because you have to be mindful of not using this skill in a manipulative or disingenuous way. If there is any manipulation, you will have the opposite effect of creating more distress and more conflict. And it can be picked up in the tone, or it can actually be even picked up in facial expressions where you may not realize it, but you'll say, "Hey, would you be willing to do this for me?" There's like a coying tone, there's a fake smile on your face. Like really, these are unconscious. Our facial expressions are unconscious. And people can pick up when words and facial expressions don't match. They may not know that that is what's actually happening unconsciously, but what they know the feel of it. They will know that this feels disingenuous. This doesn't feel good. This feels like I'm being manipulated. Because when you say, "Are you willing to?" there's something that appeals to a person's desire to want to be helpful. And so I really caution you. I am not sharing this technique with you in order to increase your success at manipulation. The key to being successful with this is authenticity and being genuine and being vulnerable. Because again, if you try to use this in a manipulative way, I promise you it will backfire on you. Now, if you've checked your manipulation at the door, let's go through the process. Like any effective communication, inquire if it's a good time to have a conversation with somebody. You don't want to bring something like this up when they're half asleep, or they just got home from work and they're exhausted, or the kids have been tugging at them all day, or you're at work and you're trying to do a needs inquiry with your supervisor and they just got chewed out by their boss. So you do want to find that time where a person has the mental and emotional bandwidth. Now, after that, there's basically 5 steps to this process. So let's go through it. So number 1 is you share what you're struggling with. And number 2, you share what you need to alleviate the struggle in concrete, actionable language. Number 3, share why the support is meaningful to you and how it might relate to the other person's needs. 4, if it is a stretch for the other person, you want to acknowledge what that cost is. And 5, ask if the person would be willing to respond to your need and be open to exploring and negotiating a win-win resolution if there's an aspect of no for the other person. Okay, no doesn't have to just be a dead end, but we want people to be genuine and comfortable and safe to say, "No, that doesn't feel like something I'm willing to do," because maybe you're hitting against their boundary and you want to be respectful, but what you're doing is opening up a dialogue. So let's break down each of the 5 steps. So step 1, share what you are struggling with. You have to validate, first of all, that you have this need and that you are in some kind of struggle, because that's what catalyzes this whole thing. You actually have to recognize you need help. And for people who have grown up in that environment where their needs have been dismissed, minimized, and criticized, this may be one of the most difficult steps. Like you may need to spend 6 months just starting to learn to recognize and validate that you have a need. Once you do that, you actually have to draw on courage to be vulnerable, because you are going to be communicating this need. So you need to draw on some courage. You have to access your ability to be vulnerable. And then the goal is to be really concise and factual. I want to be clear. This is not about justifying that you have a need. And trust me, if you are coming from that history of feeling uncomfortable about needs, there's going to be an instinct to feel like, I need to lay my case out. I need to justify. And typically, way too much information comes out, and the person that you're talking to gets overwhelmed. They also feel like it's like a sales pitch, like they're trying to be sold on something, and that's not effective. This is about the step of sharing what you're struggling with that you've validated in really concise and factual language. And be super mindful of the tone. This should not be coming out as a criticism or in a complaining kind of tone, because that is going to automatically trigger defensiveness on the other person. This is grounded in being vulnerable and that this is a legitimate need. So it sounds something more like, I'm feeling overwhelmed with everything on my plate. Okay. This is just what I'm struggling with. Step one, what am I struggling with? I'm feeling overwhelmed with everything on my plate. Step two, share what you need to alleviate the struggle in concrete, actionable language. Again, I mentioned the researcher Brene Brown. She has this great mantra, clear is kind and unclear is unkind. So, particularly for women and then also men or any people who have a history of people pleasing, you may have a tendency to try to be subtle or beating around the bush, a little bit avoidant in your language, not hitting the mark and hoping that they infer. You have to catch all of that and be much more concise and direct. For example, I need your participation in more of the home responsibilities. Okay, so that is being very concise about what I think I need to alleviate the struggle I just articulated. Three, share why supporting your need is meaningful and how it might relate to the other person's needs. So, again, this requires that self assessment that you've already done, self validation about how this is impacting you. You get grounded in your values and you share those values. It does also require that you embrace vulnerability. So, it sounds something like, feeling overwhelmed and seeing myself fall behind is affecting my self esteem and triggering my shame gremlins. And I'm also worried that I'm starting to feel resentment. And if I don't say something, that would not be fair to you. So that is very open, very honest. It's vulnerable, but it's also saying, hey, this is why this is important to me. And this is how this is also probably going to affect you. Now, step four, if it is a stretch for the other person, acknowledge that because that shows empathy and use non judgmental communication. For example, I know you have a lot on your plate too, and I want to find a solution that works for both of us. Or say the person isn't overwhelmed, but they've just been oblivious, and the cost to them is they have to start to pay attention. And so you might say something like, I know you need me to be direct with you. So that's just acknowledging, like, hey, I can't read minds, and I'm acknowledging I can't expect you to read my mind, that for you, you need this directness. And then five, ask the person, would they be willing to respond to your need and be open to exploring those win-win options. So your concrete actionable behavior, would you be willing to vacuum and maybe clean the bathrooms once a week? That would take a lot off of my plate. And then I think I'll be so much less stressed out. And I think we'd both benefit if I wasn't so exhausted. So you're explaining like specifically what it is you're proposing, why you think it'll help, and the what's in it for me, how it would benefit the other person. Now, that person, remember, we're asking about willingness, and maybe your partner or whoever you're talking to does already have a lot on their plate and they start to feel overwhelmed. Remember, no has to be an option when we're talking about willingness. But this was an opening bid. This is an invitation to have the conversation. So, for example, you have to be willing to receive that alternative where the person might say, yeah, listen, I am more than happy to do the laundry and I can clean the bathroom, but I don't know if I'm going to get around to doing vacuuming like every week. Like, what about, would every other week work? And I really want to help you, but my plate's really full too. And maybe that's acceptable. Like, oh my gosh, even every other week, that'd be really helpful. Or maybe the person comes back and says, I can do those two things, sure. But maybe we need to talk about getting someone in here once a month. Let's look at our budget, and they can do like a deep clean. And then you and I, we can just figure out what each of us can do to just keep on top of everything. Like lots of creative solutions. And that's why the language of willingness is so effective, because it tends to open up problem solving conversation that's very collaborative because there's no hidden blame. You're not getting that resentment, accusatory tone. You're coming from that place that's vulnerable and really sharing, hey, I am struggling with something. Would you be willing to help me? And that's why this is really effective. And then, like in any good conversation, remember just at the end when you wrap it up, express gratitude to the person for having this conversation and partnering with you and problem solving. So let's try another example. And this is a struggle I will hear more often from men, sometimes from women, generally people for who touch is a love language. So let's go through it again. Share what you're struggling with. And so remember, you've validated that you have a struggle. You recognize that you need cooperation from another person, and you are finding that courage to be vulnerable, particularly around intimacy and touch. This is a really vulnerable topic for people. And then be really mindful of non-judgment in your tone, right? Because this one could come out like, why haven't we been having sex? It could come out basically with a hidden message of you're not an adequate partner. So you have to be super mindful around these vulnerable topics and really get into that compassionate place, self-compassion and compassion for others. So it would sound something more like, I notice we haven't been intimate in a couple of months, and I don't exactly know why. I'm struggling with this. So that's the first step. I'm sharing my struggle. And then you share what you need to alleviate the struggle in concrete, actionable language. Again, with high vulnerable topics, you want to come up with a range of options. So, is this more about momentary just touch, reaching out or sitting on the couch and, reaching out every now and then, cuddling more, hugging? Is it just having sex more frequently? What is it exactly? And take some time to sort out the difference between what you're wanting. Is it about, I'm wanting to have more sex? Or is it, I'm needing more connection or I'm needing more intimacy, which includes that emotional component? Be really clear about this. So it might come out like, I need physical touch to feel connected to you. Now, remember, when we're talking about willingness, we're looking for what is going to work for both parties. So you share why supporting your need is meaningful to you and how it might relate to the other person's needs. You ground yourself again in that self compassion and vulnerability, and it might sound something like, when my needs for physical connection is ignored, I start to wonder if you still find me desirable or if you still find me attractive, and I feel lonely and hurt. And if this is a stretch for the other person, you can acknowledge that and say, listen, I know you give so much to the kids, to your jobs, to your friends, and I'm just wanting to find a solution that will work for both of us. Or say the person isn't overwhelmed and they just, touch isn't their love language. And so you might say, listen, I know physical touch is not one of your love languages. It's not as important to you, but considering my request would mean a lot to me. So now you're actually saying, what's in it for you? You're my partner. Touch isn't your thing, but this is an opportunity to, maybe for you it's meaningful connection, maybe for you it's affirmation, maybe for you it's gifts. Maybe there is a way to find that bridge over to your partner's natural love language, and helping them to see, I'm not just asking you to go outside your comfort zone. I'm sharing with you something I'm struggling with and inviting you to participate in a collaboration on how can we address this need that I am relying on you because you're my partner and you're who I want to get touch from. But I also want to acknowledge that you are who you are and you have your autonomy, and we need to figure out what works for both of us. So then you go to the last step, ask if the person would be willing to respond to your need in concrete actionable behavior. Would you be willing to talk about this situation and explore how to find a way for daily physical connection to become part of how we nurture our relationship in a way that works for both of us? So you're not maybe necessarily asking, "Yeah, I need to have sex every day," but you have a kiss on the way out, or you put hold hands and you go for a walk after dinner and you spend some quality, maybe your partner is quality time and you hold hands while you're doing that. Or maybe when you're watching TV, you sit together and you snuggle. Like, get creative. There's lots of ways to explore what works. And the thing is, when both of you are meeting each other's needs around how you experience love, the desire for intimacy actually increases for both of you. So what are some of the key takeaways now that we've gone through a couple of examples? We've gone through the 5 steps. The main thing is that the power of willingness framing lies in how it directly engages with a person's own sort of autonomy and with their psychological needs. By validating autonomy, we are explicitly acknowledging someone's right to choose. And that's key. It helps to reduce psychological reactivity, and that's that instinctive like reaction we have. Like, if anyone on here has ADHD or is on autistic spectrum, you may know that about half of us suffer with a co-occurring sort of neurological reaction called PDA, pathological demand avoidance. And just a request itself goes straight to the amygdala to an immediate no before you even know, like, you haven't even processed it. So this language of willingness helps to reduce that, not entirely, but it does shift the brain a little bit to possibly circumvent that instinctive reactivity to feel like I'm being impinged upon, or I'm already stressed and a new demand is being put onto me. Because that language of willingness is an invitation and it conveys respect for what the person actually is open to providing. So, because of that, it creates psychological safety. Asking for willingness implicitly communicates that it's okay to say no. And that reduces just that feeling of pressure and anxiety and allows for more of honest communication and responses. And it also respects the person's boundaries. This frame also shifts from obligation to collaboration. So the can you question, it carries sort of a implied pressure. Like, if I can, then I guess I have to. Like, if that makes sense. When you hear that, like, it's really hard to say, yeah, I can and I won't. Okay, just socially, we're not entirely wired that way. So asking can you does create that automatic obligation. And that change to willingness, it transforms the dynamic from a potential obligation to voluntary partnership. And that is a powerful shift. This frame also acknowledges emotional labor or emotional effort. So when we're focusing on willingness rather than just physical capacity, it recognizes that I'm actually asking for involvement of emotional and mental effort. That's why that 4th step, is acknowledging if there's a cost to the other person. By being explicit about that and bringing that empathy forward, it acknowledges the other person, and they will respond because they feel seen and they feel validated. So finally, it builds trust and intimacy. When we acknowledge others' right to choose, we demonstrate respect for their internal experience. And that will ultimately deepen your connection and trust in your relationship, because it fundamentally says, I care about you. I'm being self validating, I'm being self respecting, I'm being honest, and I'm sharing with you this need and this struggle. And I also am respecting that you are your own person and you have choice here. So the framework is powerful because it aligns with core human psychological needs of autonomy, respect, and self determination. It's a subtle shift in language, but it actually produces really positive results in relationships and in a sense of personal empowerment. And this technique really does work whether it is your intimate partner, whether it is family members, co-workers, bosses, having this framework can just really help you feel more confident in asking for needs because it's collaborative. Because I know for some people, asking for needs, the immediate thought is, I'm a burden. So by using the language of willingness, we are actually circumventing that because what we're doing is we're inviting dialogue, we're inviting collaboration and partnership that is already built into it, respect for the other person's autonomy and their boundaries. So I hope that this particular skill set will be helpful for you. Please take your time to go through it. I will put the steps in the notes below so that you can always come back to this episode and go to the notes and review what the steps are. And I want to thank everybody for listening. If you know somebody who struggles with needs and communicating those needs, please consider sharing it because that also helps us get our channel out to other people. Don't forget, please subscribe, leave a review, again, 7 words or more, share your comments below. And until next time, stay curious and kind, and we'll see you later. Bye.